Thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Nicole Bivens-Sidak, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Vice President at Freedom House. Want to welcome everyone to this conversation, which will be dealing today with a phenomenon called transnational repression. It's when authoritarian governments reach across borders, often into democracies, to silence dissent and to silence the voice of those who are raising their voices for freedom. We've been studying and reporting on this growing threat for more than a year now, and I hope that you'll be able to look at our seminal report on it to learn about how extensive this phenomenon really is. Today, I'd like to thank our panelists and our moderator and our partner, Michael Isikoff from Yahoo News. Michael is finishing up a groundbreaking podcast on the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, one of the most well-known cases and tragic cases of transnational repression. I know you will be as interested as all of us are to hear all that he has to say about what he's found. Thank you for your partnership and for your work on that, Michael. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Kim Ghattas. Kim is a journalist well known to many of us, formerly of the BBC and now with The Atlantic, and a scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's also just released an important book called Black Wave. It covers Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the conflict in the Middle East. Kim, thank you so much for being with us today and leading us in this conversation. I'll turn it over to you to introduce the rest of our panelists. Thank you to each of them.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for having me to moderate this very important conversation. Good evening from Beirut, where I am currently based. After many years in Washington, I came back home. This topic is one I instantly said yes to as a moderator, because as I said, it is one that is important, it is urgent, it is one which is touching more and more people across the world, from Russia to Iran to Saudi Arabia, of course, which is the focus of part of our discussion today, China as well. And I really do urge you, indeed, if you're joining us today, to read the report that Freedom House put out on transnational repression. It makes for really chilling reading. The link is in the chat box today, is in the chat box that you have on your screens. We will get to questions in the latter part of the discussion, and I'll come to them. You can type them into the chat box. But I first want to introduce our panelists. You just heard already Nicole telling us about Michael Isikoff, who's joining us. He's the chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News and host of the Conspiracy Land podcast, which produced an 8-part series on the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. We also have, he's in Washington. We also have joining us from Brussels, Lina Al-Hathloul, sister, of course, of the famous Saudi human rights activist, freedoms activist, Lujain Al-Hathloul, who was in jail for several years, only recently released. A former political prisoner kidnapped by the Saudi government from the UAE, a live example there as well of transnational repression and rendition. Lina herself is a trained lawyer and a member of the National Assembly Party, a newly formed Saudi party hoping to create more space for civil society. And from Freedom House itself, Nate Schenken, Director of Research Strategy at Freedom House. As I said, we'll have time for questions in the latter part of the session. Do type them into the chat box. I will keep an eye on them and get to them as we go along. One of the big news today is a story in the United States about Masih Alinejad, an Iranian human rights and freedom activist who's living in the United States as a dual citizen. And the news today is of a plot by Iranian intelligence officials to abduct her from New York and take her back to Iran, her home country. The indictments are out, and it makes this conversation today ever more important. And so, Nate, I want to start with you. I know that part of the discussion will be focused on the example of Saudi Arabia, what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, what happened to Lujain Al-Hathloul. But I want to start with you to give us the bigger context, which you write about and your colleagues write about in the report. because this is happening everywhere. It happens across borders, it happens in all sorts of countries, and it requires the cooperation of several parties. This isn't just the doing of one government. So walk us through a little bit, what is this problem of transnational repression and how does it work and who is involved?
Thank you. Thanks, Kim, for that introduction, and thank you to all the other panelists for joining us. And yes, indeed, this is very much a moment when we see this phenomenon becoming mainstream, I suppose one could say. The big picture for what we see in transnational repression, as reflected in the report that we released in February, is that it is becoming a normal phenomenon. It's becoming something that dozens of governments around the world use to try to control exiles, diaspora members abroad. In this report, what we identified were over 600 incidents that we identified and coded of direct physical transnational repression. So times when the governments reached the bodies of those individuals themselves. And these were governments from 31 different origin countries acting in 79 different host countries around the world. So indeed, this is taking place all around us. It's taking place in the United States, it's taking place in Belgium, it's taking place in Germany, as well as in the United Arab Emirates and in many countries all over the world. What we see in the Saudi example, and what we also see in the case that was revealed last night concerning Masih Ali-Nejad, are many of the trends that we discussed in this report. And indeed, Iran and Saudi Arabia are included as case studies in the report for this reason. First is that there is this full spectrum of tactics that are used in transnational repression. The perpetrators don't have respect for neat divisions between one and the other. So there are digital tactics, harassment and intimidation, but also spyware that bleeds into more direct attempts at violence, assault, assassination, kidnapping, that are also tied up with pressure and intimidation and harassment of family members, what we call coercion by proxy. And all of these are enmeshed, and to deal with the problem, we have to look at it as a full spectrum. The second, as you said, Kim, is cooperation. Though we do frequently think of these things as being unilateral actions, that's actually quite rare. And I think Michael has some very interesting and important reporting in what he's recently done about cooperation, even in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, and how other countries may have been involved in that plot. And finally, and this is where we will be talking, I think, later perhaps about recommendations, is impunity. Countries do it because they can get away with it. And because the consequences are not there. And certainly this has been starkly illustrated in the Saudi case, where there continue to not be adequate consequences for what is the most high profile incident still of transnational repression in recent history. So with all that said, I'm very glad to be here. It's so wonderful to be on a panel with you all. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nate. It's great to get this macro picture. It's terrifying to hear that so many countries are involved in this and that there is, in a way, impunity. I mean, we know there is impunity, but it means that it doesn't matter where you are. There are long arms of repressive regimes that can reach you, and it's not clear how Western governments or democracies or governments trying to push back against such behaviors can handle this, but we'll get to that in a moment. I did want to ask you first one question before I go to Michael. Some of the tactics involved, some of the tactics used involve rendition, and I know that's a word that became famous, infamous during the war on terror as well. The US was involved in incidents of rendition. What is different about what we're seeing, what you detail in this report?
Sorry. The first difference, or the most important difference, I would say, is that the war on terror rendition program that the United States operated very frequently did involve unilateral, kind of these classically unilateral actions, one could argue. Many of the renditions that we see now in these actions involve very intense host state cooperation. So for instance, Turkey's campaign abroad, which is the most comprehensive campaign globally in the last 5 years, is a campaign that always involves very close cooperation with host state security services. That, I think, changes and enriches the way in which we think about renditions and think about how we might be putting a stop to them. I think it is perhaps in some ways easier for us all to imagine that it's a case of one bad actor or one bad set of institutions from one country rather than a cooperative process. The second point, though, that I would add on that, and we reflected this in the report, the war on terror does play an important role in this, at the very minimum as breaking some of the norms and some of the standards that should have acted as a bulwark against establishing transnational repression as a normal behavior among states. And unfortunately, we do see states repeatedly citing the US war on terror as a model, or at least as a justification for the activities that they do abroad as well.
Okay. Thank you, Nate, for this. Michael, I want to turn to you, but before I ask you a question and we hear more from you, we're going to take a look at the trailer for the incredible podcast that you produced as part of the Conspiracyland podcast that focused on the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. It's a 2.5-minute trailer. We'll take a quick look and then come back to the questions.
An international mystery with a growing demand for answers.
Khashoggi entered the Saudi consulate last Tuesday. His friends say they haven't heard from him since.
Jamal Khashoggi was his country's most prominent journalist, writing for one of America's premier newspapers. What happened to him inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul was shocking. But there is much more to the story that you've never heard, and one big question still outstanding.
There has not been any justice. I'm wondering why they killed Jamal.
The more one digs into his murder, the more it becomes clear. This was the result of a real-life conspiracy. There are new details from inside Saudi Arabia, never reported before, about how exactly Khashoggi was killed, pointing to accomplices still in the shadows. And it was directed from the top by Saudi Arabia's ruthless and all-powerful crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, otherwise known as MBS.
Are you saying that MBS is your SOB?
No, I'm saying he's the US's SOB.
And all this against the backdrop of a conspiracy of silence at the highest levels in Washington, while the Saudis gobbled up American weapons by the boatload.
$6 billion, that's for frigates. 889 million, 63 million, and that's for various artillery.
And at the center of it all, a world-famous journalist whose career was marked by layers of contradictions and secrets.
If somebody sits across from you and tells you that Jamal told them everything, they're 100% lying to you. He kept all of it with himself, and he gave different people the things that they needed to know.
But when he starts to criticize the crown prince and plot ways to counter his repression, Khashoggi and his allies find themselves in the crosshairs of a global campaign of surveillance.
I think MBS saw it as a moment to brag, saying, yeah, it was us. We have our guy at Twitter.
There's a direct trail of blood drops from this hack to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
Coming June 14th, a new season of Yahoo News' Conspiracyland, the secret lives and brutal death of Jamal Khashoggi. It turns out some conspiracies are real.
That's only too unfortunate that indeed some conspiracies are real, and that was a terrible one that unfolded and took Jamal Khashoggi's life. Jamal was a friend of mine, was a friend of many of us. Michael, why did you decide to focus your podcast that season on this killing? You know, it was covered in the news, a lot of reporting was out there, it made headlines. Why did you decide to dig deeper on that issue, on that event?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question, Kim, and thanks for Freedom House for sponsoring this event, which is so important. And as we saw in the indictment yesterday out of Brooklyn, is still an issue very much that ought to be on the world's agenda. You know, you're right. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi, you know, got unbelievable attention. It was so high profile. He was so well known in the West, known to journalists who covered the Mideast for years. And the details were so gruesome and so grisly. But the more I looked at it, it was so clear that we only know a portion of the story. There is so much more that really needs to be investigated and fully aired. I have this exchange with John Bolton in the podcast. It's in episode 8, where he is, at one point, he refers to what happened to Khashoggi as a mistake by the Saudis. And I say, a mistake? This was a crime, right? And he brushes that off, is a murder a crime or a mistake? And he brushes that off and, quotes Talleyrand saying it's worse than a crime, it's a mistake. But from my perspective, and maybe, from his perspective, national security implications, I can understand, where he's coming from. But from my perspective as an investigative journalist, it's a murder. And I've covered murders in my career as a journalist. I've covered many crimes, and you want to get the full story. And look at, the US government has released very little of the intelligence it has about what it knows happened to Jamal. The Saudis hold this trial, closed door trial, no press allowed, no human rights monitors allowed, no public record exists, no questioning, much less charges against the high-level officials who clearly would have had to have been knowledgeable and approved the operation. And, none of that has taken place. So we were able to get add details that hadn't been out there before. One in particular, the Cairo stopover that the plane took that was carrying the Tiger team of assassins, makes this late night stopover for Cairo. And in the notes taken by Turkish embassy observers who were allowed to sit in on that trial, there are references to the fact that the purpose was to pick up a lethal dose of drugs that was used to kill Khashoggi, injected into his left arm within minutes after he entered the consulate by a Saudi Ministry of Interior doctor. An official government doctor injected those drugs that killed Khashoggi. And then, of course, it's followed by the...
And do you think, Michael, was it apparent to you whether the Egyptian authorities knew what had been, how they had played a role in this transnational crime?
Look,
transborder crime?
We don't know. What we know is that the Sisi regime in Cairo was backed the coup in which Sisi seized power from the elected Muslim Brotherhood president, Mohammed Morsi, was backed by the Saudis. It was funded by the Saudis. They poured billions of dollars into propping up the Sisi regime. So there's this very close relationship between the two. We also know, as I reported, that in an earlier rendition of another Saudi prince, the Saudis turned to the Egyptians for help. This was one from a Saudi prince in Italy who was abducted and hasn't been heard from again. So what exactly the Egyptians knew about what the lethal dose of drugs that was being provided to the Saudi assassins, what it was being used for, we don't know. But given the close relationship between those two governments, it's hard to imagine that they weren't in some way complicit in the crime. And just one final thought, we talked, Nate was talking about the indictment out of Brooklyn today, or yesterday, about the Iranian-American journalist who the Iranians were plotting, had surveillance and then plotting to kidnap. You take away the fact that the journalist was apparently an American citizen, but she was living in the United States, as was Jamal. He was a US resident. But in every other respect, the parallels are striking. Intensive surveillance of the suspect, that was what was done to Jamal. You know, the Saudis had their criminal scheme to steal data about Saudi dissidents from Twitter. Then they use the Pegasus spyware developed by the Israeli Defense Forces to target the phones of dissidents, including one, Omar Abdulaziz, who Jamal was in close contact with all throughout the last months of his life. And yet, in the Iranian case, the U.S. Justice Department views it as a criminal conspiracy, and they indict people. They don't do that in Jamal's case, and I think that that's the differences there are worth asking questions about.
Thank you, Michael. The case that you detail, and then we'll hear, people can listen to the podcast and hear exactly how it exemplifies what we're discussing today as this issue of transnational repression, and we'll hear a little bit more from you. But I want to turn to Lina. Thank you very much for joining us from Brussels. Your sister has been through an awful ordeal. Your whole family has suffered through this, and you and your siblings have done an incredible job, or did an incredible job, and continue to do an incredible job to raise awareness about Loujane's plight. She was released earlier this year. She's still facing challenges and restrictions. You are interviewed, Lina, in Michael's podcast about the terrible torture that your sister endured in prison. If it's not too painful, I'd love to hear more from you, and our audience would want to hear more from you about what your sister went through and how she was taken from outside of Saudi Arabia back into the country, and her husband as well, taken from Jordan, if I'm not mistaken, and what this says, what your family went through, but what you have to say to others who may be going through this or have gone through this as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I might not start as I usually do with her arrest, or with the time she was kidnapped from the Emirates. I might start even earlier. Because the issue is really important about transnational repression. So when Loujaine was first arrested, I had no idea what her activism was. I knew she was famous for driving, etc. I was not really into all the details. But then when she was arrested, I started, discovering everything she's done, the people she was meeting, etc. And I'll talk about the details of the arrest and the torture just after it. So once we got her charges, so after 1 year approximately after her arrest, I read all the charges and I tried to contact the people who were mentioned in the charges. And one of her charges, they accused her of having a course on cybersecurity in Madrid in Spain. So I contacted the people who were doing this course. And finally, they told me, yes, Loujaine, when they looked into her computer and they saw that her email was hacked somewhere in the Emirates before even she knew anything. And that she called the Saudis when she found out about it, thinking that they might protect her. And they said, oh, really? Okay, we'll see what we can do. And they didn't do anything about it. And Loujaine was really shocked, to find out that the Emirates were hacking her, but she didn't do any links. And then, of course, in March 2018, after she came back from a conference of the UN, she was kidnapped. She was kidnapped, and we of course got the details later on, by official UAE cars. So again, it's cooperation. The Saudis are not doing this alone. They are cooperating with the Saudis repression. And so she was kidnapped, she was flown back to Saudi Arabia. And again, what's important to know is that we still don't know which plane it was. We don't know if it's a Saudi plane, if it's a UAE plane, but anyway, people were there. No one dared to tell her who they were working from. They were only saying that they got orders. So Loujaine had no idea who was kidnapping her and where they were bringing her. And then everything really happened, where she got arrested a month later. and she disappeared. She was held incommunicado for a couple of weeks. And then she called us saying that she was fine, that she was in a palace, in a private hotel, and that everything was okay. And she used to call quite a lot at that time. And then in August, my parents were allowed to see her. And they saw that, again, sorry, it's always so difficult for me, but they saw that she was shaking and that she had bruises and sorry, it's been years, I still can't do it. That she had bruises and that she was shaking and that she had frightened looks. And they asked her what was wrong. She would, at the beginning, of course, say that it's only the air that was too cold, that this would sometimes deprive her of sleep for interrogations, and that the food was not too good, but nothing too bad, I would say, for a prison in Saudi. And then, month after month, we saw reports about the torture in the Ritz-Carlton were out, the Khashoggi murder, and we got also details of that. So their next visit, my parents really said, they told Lujain, look, now we read everything, please tell us, look at you, it's impossible that you have not been one of the victims. And then that's when she cried and she showed her the bruise. She showed them the bruises on her thighs. They were really blackened because she told them that during the time in her private, what she used to call a private hotel, it was basically a torture facility where they would electrocute her, sexually harass her, flog her, deprive her of sleep. That when she entered this hotel room, really it was a hotel room, there were men sitting all over the room, and there was one chair in the middle, and that they just told her to sit there, and then that's when they started to electrocute her and sexually harass her, and this went on for weeks. And then she was brought back to the official prison, and then she complained about the torture. Of course, no one answered this complaint, and still till today they deny everything. This is for my sister's story. What I want to say is, of course, there's transnational repression. Some countries are complicit with what is happening to my sister and to so many others, but there are also some countries that can act, and when they do, there is consequences. But for example, just for the US, it was so difficult for us to advocate for Lujain's release when Trump was the president, because they were too close to MBS, who was newly the crown prince. But now that for example, the US, there's a new president who literally said my sister's name explicitly, saying that he's happy that she's released, that it was a mistake to imprison her. I think they should do more, because our government and any repressive government, when they know that the world knows what they're doing and they're not sanctioned, they know that it's just a green light for them to go on and double down even. And impunity only is worse than anything. When you don't know who a criminal is and you don't do anything about it, it's not as worse as knowing who the criminal is and telling him, okay, you can just go on and we will just turn a blind eye. And it's not only, dangerous for us, we see it for the whole region. I mean, the embargo on Qatar, it was horrific for them, the worst humanitarian crisis in Yemen, and it's still ongoing, and the whole world got involved, and now they regret it. So I don't think letting such an unreliable ally go on with their crimes is the best solution. I think that the world, the international community has so much leverage on him, because at least for Saudi Arabia on MBS, because he has no legitimacy at all within the royal family. No one likes him. He did a coup on his cousin. The people didn't choose him. So there is really no legitimacy. And the only thing that makes him stay in power is the fact that the international community is silent about him and his crimes. So I just want to encourage the international community to to put sanctions on who they know committed these crimes.
I want to get to the topic of impunity and the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the US in a moment. Michael, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just want to make one quick point about the story Lena was just saying about her sister in the Conspiracy Land podcast, in which Lena and her brother Walid both appear. They talk about who was supervising that torture of Loujain. And it was Saud al-Qahtani, the right-hand man to MBS, who is there greeting her when when the torturers arrive, threatening her, and even saying at one point, according to the account that Loujain gave to her family, I will cut you into pieces. So the overlap between what happened to Loujain and what happened to Jamal is pretty striking.
I want to dig deeper into impunity and the relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia and the US and other countries and how we deal with impunity. And we'll get to that with Nate in a moment. But Lena, I want to ask you another question. I want to ask you about your reaction to the news about Masih Alinejad. Of course, Saudi Arabia and Iran are, at loggerheads, they're rivals, etc. But I think the peoples could certainly be in much better ties. Michael alluded a little bit to that at the beginning, to sort of say, the resemblance between the behavior of these renditions and this transnational repression that Iran is known for is also being used by Saudi Arabia. And I write in my own book, Black Wave, about how it looked to me under Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia kind of took a page out of Iran's book. This is the kind of stuff that Iran used to do, still does. It wasn't something that was really part of the register of Saudi Arabia as a state. With all its shortcomings, faults, etc., we had never seen this kind of behavior before. We had seen, the abduction of princes, but it was kind of an internal royal family matter. And so I'm very interested in your reaction, Lena, as a Saudi, as the sister of Loujain, to the news that we saw yesterday about Masih Alinejad.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think my reaction is like anyone's reaction. We are really sad, and it's a horrific attempt to silence the dissent. And I think we all agree on this. But what I can say is, from my Saudi background, is that it's always so sad and frustrating to see that rival governments and countries use crimes of their rivals to minimize and justify what is happening within their own sphere. So when we see it, for example, now here, you see all the Saudis saying, oh, you see, Iran is worse than us. Of course, we make mistakes. But so my message is, and I don't think they're necessarily people who work for the government, they're just maybe nationalists and who don't really understand that the government is also against them. They're not only against people who speak out or are politically involved or activists or anything, That's one part of the Saudi society that is still applauding everything the government is doing without really understanding that they're oppressed, basically. So my message is, we should be against repression, whatever the nationality of the criminal is. We should be by the side of freedoms and by the side of the people and by the side of justice, wherever it is. So this is really the first comment I have in mind, because, I see it with the Twitter I have. A lot of people were criticizing it and minimizing Jamal Khashoggi's death because it is happening by Iran. So this is really frustrating and sad for me to see as a Saudi that because our rivals are doing crimes, then our government is better. This is
can get away with it. Yeah. Yes, yeah. These comparisons, it becomes a competition for who can do the worst. Michael, I want to draw you in a little bit on some of your reporting also, and what you're seeing unfold in Washington today, and Nate, feel free to jump in here as well. There is the issue of values. It's an important one. It's one that the US talks about a lot, not so much under the Trump administration, but it often runs against interests. And the relationship with Saudi Arabia is a complicated one. We've seen now under the Biden administration an effort to provide some more balance. They did release the report, although albeit redacted, on the Khashoggi killing. But there is, of course, still a relationship. Mohammed bin Salman himself was not sanctioned. Others were sanctioned. There are travel bans in place. How do you see the Biden administration approaching this relationship as it talks about the need to shore up democratic values and values?
Look, clearly compared to the Trump White House and its approach to these issues, Biden has reinforced that human rights and democratic values are, central to our value system, and therefore will play into how we fashion our foreign policy. And as they've said, they have recalibrated the relationship with Saudi Arabia. But if you look at what Biden and members of his campaign were saying last year and compare it to what they've actually done, the gap is pretty striking. Biden said when he was running for president, he would make the Saudis pay a price for what happened to Khashoggi. He would make them a pariah as a country. He would end U.S. arms sales for the war in Yemen. And look, yes, they released this pretty skimpy report, which didn't really add much. Yes, rhetorically, they got out there what had been widely reported, that the U.S. intelligence community had concluded that MBS himself had authorized the operation to capture or kill Khashoggi. But beyond that, what happened just a few days before the release of that report? Lloyd Austin, Biden's Secretary of Defense, calls his counterpart in Riyadh, the defense minister of Saudi Arabia, the very same MBS. And what's the purpose of the call, according to the Pentagon readout? To reaffirm the strategic partnership between the United States and Saudi Arabia, not exactly making them a world pariah, was it? KBS, Khalid bin Salman, the brother of MBS, who was Saudi ambassador at the time, and who, as we disclose in the podcast, we have a former National Security Council official talking about how the US had intelligence that KBS denied Jamal's attempt to get those divorce records from the Saudi embassy in Washington, forcing him to go to Istanbul, essentially making KBS, a co-conspirator, complicit in the plot. We don't know what he knew was going to happen to Jamal in Istanbul, but as Kirsten Fontenrose says in the podcast, the assumption was because they knew they could not kidnap or kill him in Washington, better to get him in Istanbul. And yet there is KBS being welcomed last week by the Biden White House. Jake Sullivan is meeting with him, and the Deputy Secretary of Defense is meeting with him. So, it is, I got to say, to those who thought, listening to Biden's rhetoric during the campaign, that there was going to be a strong pushback and make the Saudis pay a price so there would not be impunity, people have to be disappointed in what they're seeing now.
Nate, let's discuss what Michael just brought up in terms of impunity, accountability, how it works differently for America's allies, for America's foes. Of course, people were disappointed that Mohammed bin Salman was not sanctioned. I can also see those who say that because the United States needs to engage in negotiations with Iran on the nuclear file, it cannot afford to have the Saudis alienated. I mean, you can only imagine the celebrations at the Supreme Leader's house in Tehran or in Qom if Mohammed bin Salman had been sanctioned. There is an issue with realpolitik and with pragmatic politics. How do you deal with transnational repression? How do you address the issue of impunity and accountability in a world of politics and interests?
Yeah, it's obviously a very difficult question, and I'm not going to walk away from it by just saying that it's complicated. I will note that this administration, the new administration, is talking about transnational repression. It is a marked change. This is something that's been happening really since the beginning of the administration. They are engaged in pretty serious conversations internally about what kind of longer-term policy steps they take to deal with this problem as a longer-term policy problem, stepping away from an individual murder or kidnapping. However, for sure, it doesn't solve the issue of, I think what's really made clear in the indictment last night, of criminal accountability when there's a crime. And this isn't the first case, I should note, of essentially transnational repression being prosecuted recently. There were 2 cases in the fall concerning China, one involving an NYPD officer who had allegedly been recruited by the Chinese government to spy on the Tibetan community around New York. Another involving a conspiracy to kidnap someone in what's called the Fox Hunt campaign for former Chinese Communist Party officials. Again, however, these are cases involving a geopolitical rival or hostile power to the United States. And so the biggest question is, can the United States engage in those kinds of, I would say, especially criminal investigations and criminal prosecutions when it involves an ally, or when it involves a partner, Saudi Arabia, or it's Turkey, or it's a country in a key strategic region like Rwanda that plays a very important security role, but is really engaged in very overt criminal activity and human rights violations. I think the blunt answer to that is there has to be one standard. It can't be different standards for different countries, especially when they engage in what are overt criminal activities. Certainly criminal accountability is a very important part of it. The other is civil and opening the door to civil suits. There are civil suits. Masih Alinejad has a civil suit that's been out there for a couple of years concerning the things that have been done to her and her family against the Iranian government. Saad al-Jabri has a civil suit against the Saudi government. He's a former intelligence chief in Saudi Arabia who's now in exile and has faced these transnational repression threats. So opening the door to those kinds of civil suits, making it possible to hold people accountable in that way would also be an important step.
Just a reminder to our audience that you can submit questions in the chat, and we will get to them as we go along. We have another 10 minutes or so to go for this event. Nate, I want to follow up with one more question to you and then go back to Lena and Michael. How are America's friends and America's foes different in how they are using the opportunity of transnational repression? Or is it, as we just discussed, kind of similar? I mean, the Iranians and the Saudis are kind of using the same methods. It's really striking. And who are the biggest offenders? I would seem to think it might be Russia or China, but is that a false impression? Tell us more.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I don't think you can make a clear kind of binary distinction in terms of the tactics between one or the other. One of the things that's unique or notable about Iran's campaign, which it is really a campaign abroad, is that they can seldom rely on the kind of cooperation that many other countries can. Obviously, Iran is a country that has very fraught relations, not only with the United States, but with many European powers. And therefore, its actions and the kind of transnational repression that it's engaged in frequently is with less of a cooperative component.
And yet still so successful.
And yet still successful, and still finds opportunities and still finds ways to get it done. Now, in terms of this question around what do allies do, we do see some very important allies who are engaged in transnational repression. Absolutely. I've mentioned Turkey already. Turkey's campaign is among the largest in the last 5 years. This has involved the rendition of over 100 people from maybe as many as 24 countries around the world. And these are renditions. These are people being returned without legal process, without any opportunity to have their cases heard or to be prevented from being refouled to torture. Additionally, of course, China. When you asked about the biggest perpetrators, China is extremely active in this field. There you have a real mix. You have some unilateral actions. You have some, in places like the United States, where they certainly would find cooperation very difficult to come by, but you also have cooperation. You do have China exerting leverage, including in Europe, to have people detained, to have people deported, and you have a very wide target set. Throughout the transnational repression field, when we talk about this, what we see is that domestic politics are mirrored abroad. So for a country like China, in which domestic criticism and also different kinds of domestic identities, so religious identities, ethnic identities, are perceived as threats to the state, when those identities go abroad or those critics go abroad, they're still perceived as threats to the state. We see this in the Iranian case, Saudi case, Turkish case as well. And so the tighter that is, the tighter and harder that clampdown is domestically, and the bigger that group is that's in focus, the bigger it will be abroad in most cases.
Michael, Nate was just telling us you can't really sort of differentiate between friends and foes of America. Not that we want to tie this all to the United States necessarily, but you can't necessarily differentiate, you know, how they do things differently. But what you can differentiate, or what is a responsibility within the US, is not just the impunity and the trying to end the impunity and trying to bring accountability and opening the way to these civil suits and criminal suits, but also the media. What is the responsibility of the media in how it portrays these issues and how it portrays leaders of some of these countries? I mean, remember that Mohammed bin Salman was lauded and feted as, the reformer of the country, with his tours to Silicon Valley and Harvard, etc. Wasn't it obvious from the beginning that, he wasn't, it was obvious to me, perhaps because I'm from the region, but I wonder, the responsibility of the media in sort of latching onto the narrative of this reformer, which turned out to be, faulty, to say the least.
Absolutely. I mean, there was a governmental failure here, and there was a huge media failure as well. Episode 5 of our podcast, The Rise of the Bullet Guy, a reference to MBS, explores just the way he wowed America's power elite, playing the grand piano in John Kerry's living room, yucking it up with Obama's ambassador to Riyadh, who talks about this, Joseph Westphal, in the podcast. Tom Friedman interviewing him repeatedly and lauding him as saying, if MBS didn't exist, he would have to have been invented. He's the savior. He can be the savior of his country. And yet, there were red flags all along. Ben Rhodes talks about how, being in a meeting with MBS when he starts lecturing Obama about the Saudi justice system and saying, what is this guy talking about? All the everything that was known about his background. The bullet guy is a reference to him sending a bullet to a real estate executive in Saudi Arabia, demanding that he get the property that he wanted. That should have told people something. So yes, this was as striking a case of the media and the foreign policy elite of America getting it wrong as, one can only think of parallels going back to, Soviet Russia in the 1930s and Walter Duranty, the New York Times columnist, just brushing aside the Ukrainian famine. That's what comes to my mind.
Lina, what did you think about the fawning coverage of Mohammed bin Salman? Were there red flags for you from the beginning? What do you think is the responsibility of the media in the US and in Western countries to take a better look at those leaders who are depicted as reformers. And here again, I want to point out that even Bashar al-Assad, who is not a friend of America, was depicted as a potential reformer and turned out to be quite the bloody dictator. What is it about some of these leaders that make it look like they could be reformers in the eyes of the West, while people in the region know full well that that's not the kind of reform they're going to bring to the people of the region?
Mm-hmm. I think I will be a bit more nuanced than Michael, because I must say, us as Saudis and many of us, the red flags, we only saw them later on. Honestly, we've been living with a royal family with older kings and crown princes who had always the same narrative, and it was almost like change was never going to happen. I mean, very slowly, basically. And when he came, I can understand that people believed him, and I will never blame them. Yeah, I think a lot, yes, including me, to be honest. Not all my family, but I was hopeful, and I thought maybe it could, be the right man in the right place at the right moment. But then I joined Michael for that. Is that the red flags came really fast. So when he started to imprison the clerics, I understand that the West doesn't really care about it, because he can say that. So the first wave of arrest was basically the clerics. The West, I can understand that they might say, okay, they will believe the narrative the government was saying, they're extremists, that he wants to end extremism in Saudi Arabia. Okay, but then, when he starts arresting everyone, that's when the red flags are. When he starts arresting businessmen, princes, people of their own family, the royal family, and then when he starts with the professors, the activists, the feminists, and then the whole society is in danger. And we realize, okay, this man is just against anyone who doesn't applaud him enough. And then that's when the role of media comes, because again, media should reflect, reality, or at least what they hear from people. And when the Saudis don't really comment or criticize what is happening, the media can't really know. But at some point, it was so difficult for us to have the media by our side at the beginning, telling them, we had to explain everything that was going on in the country, because, for example, that was even after my sister's arrest. They were talking about the crown prince easing the male guardianship system, which basically considers women as minors till the end of their lives in Saudi, which is true. He eased it, but they don't picture the full context. So, for example, women can travel without the consent of their male guardian now, but there's still the disobedience law, which basically allows the male guardian to arrest his daughter or wife if she travels without his consent. So again, MBS was quite smart for that, to be able to picture himself as a reformer, but just, giving some changes and reforms that the West is going to publish in their media. So I think the most important thing for us to be safe and for the media to stay as truthful and to reality is to listen also to dissenting voices that cannot be heard. We have been heard at some point because Lou Jane has a picture, she has a name. She was even famous before her arrest. But for people who don't have our context, our circumstances, it's so difficult for them to be heard. So I think more investigation, as Michael is doing, and believing the people inside of the country, and being able to be more lenient in their ethics, or I don't know how to say this, but to hear them and to try to publish their stories without having to name them or to put them in danger.
Thank you, Lina. You make some very important points. I think it goes to the heart of the discussion and also to the wider issue of media coverage of countries in the Middle East, but also elsewhere, where someone who comes in as a reformer, says all the right things, looks like he's secular, and wanting to bring some openness to the country, but hiding some of these more repressive, autocratic tendencies. We've seen that with Mohammed bin Salman, we've seen that with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, we've seen that with Bashar al-Assad. So it requires some nuance. But to close our discussion, we have a few minutes left. I want to end with Nate. Freedom House gets the last word. If you could tell us a little bit more, Nate, about this difficult balance for the US and for other countries that would like to be on the side of accountability, be on the side of ending impunity, while there are commercial interests, political interests, not just with Saudi Arabia, but also with China, with Russia, etc. We look at how Germany deal with some of the issues that have to do with Russia. It's complicated, and I don't want to repeat the cliche of it's complicated. There are ways and there are laws to help bring this about, because transnational repression ends up also hurting and interests of Western democracies. So how can we move from transnational repression to transnational justice? Nate.
Thank you. And it's a great way to frame the question. I think that one of the key points I would make is that at the core of the issue, the bigger issue beyond an individual incident, is this question of how do you cooperate? How do you have relations in a globalized world with countries that are not democratic and that will be trying to pursue people abroad? And much of what we see, this is not what has happened to Lena's sister or not what has happened to Jamal, but much of what we see in this field actually takes place within migration systems. It takes place within the manipulation of law enforcement in the host countries. And the reason it is able to take place is because those host countries are concerned about security, or they're concerned about organized crime, or they're under, frankly, xenophobic pressure to restrict the ability of people to gain asylum in their country. And that is a scenario and a setting that creates ripe opportunities for manipulation and abuse by the origin state. And it is also, however, inevitable. It is inevitable that there will be cooperation with a state like Saudi Arabia. It's even inevitable that there will be cooperation with a state like Russia. Germany cannot opt out of having a level of engagement with Russia, and that is never going to be the choice. The choice is going to be, how do you protect your own institutions and your own systems from being manipulated and being taken over to reach people, to subject innocent victims to surveillance, to repression, and even to violence. And I think that is why so much of this comes down to a very frank and very honest conversation internally within democracies about making our systems resilient against those kinds of manipulation efforts, and then also adding on top of that the very necessary accountability for when crimes do occur. Certainly, we can't avoid accountability. There has to be accountability, otherwise it is a situation of impunity going forward.
Yes, and as we see in the Middle East, continued impunity feeds instability, and I think that's a lesson that resonates today, everywhere. That without accountability, there is no stability, nowhere, not in the Middle East, and not anywhere. Nate Chenkin, thank you very much for your interventions. Thank you to Freedom House for having this very important discussion. Thank you for to Lina Al-Hathloul joining us from Brussels for her very important contributions, for her struggle along with her siblings and her sister Loujain to fight back against transnational repression. Their families paid a personal price in all of this. Michael, thank you very much for your work, for your reporting, and for this excellent podcast that you put together. I highly recommend everyone listen to it, and of course read the Freedom House report on transnational repression. The link is in the chat room. For me in Beirut, Kim Ghattas, that's it. Thank you for joining us. Good evening from Beirut. Good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are joining us. Thank you and good night.